All right, now when it comes to warping in Ableton Live, I pretty much developed a 3-step rule when it comes to warping that'll help you seamlessly warp any audio that you're going to use in your projects. So step 1 is find your downbeat. And then once you find your downbeat, you're going to go ahead and declare bar 1, beat 1 here. And after that, you'll go ahead and choose warp from here. So to walk through these different steps, let's go ahead and grab a piece of audio from my browser window. All right, so I'll just drag and drop that into my audio track. Now, as you might notice that this audio that I've just brought into this session is not warped from the get-go. I mean, it's Ableton Live did not automatically try to warp this. And that is because I have purposely disabled that setting in Ableton Live in the preferences. So if we head to your preference window, you want to make sure you head over to the record, warp, and launch section. And in the middle here, you have your warp section in the menu. By default, Ableton Live will have auto warp long samples on. I technically just don't like Ableton to automatically try to warp it, so I want to be more in control of how that audio file is going to be warped. So I just turn that off. So once I've done that, every audio file that that's a little bit longer than a minute or so will not be automatically warped. So let's go ahead and follow those 3 steps that I mentioned earlier. Step 1, let's find that downbeat. Now, you have the little play marker here, and that basically is your starting position. So wherever you navigate that, that's where that clip or that audio will begin. Right? So if we went ahead and just moved that all the way over here to the middle, that's where it starts. So finding your downbeat does not technically mean that you have to start at the very first sound you see in the audio. As you can see, we have a drum roll, and so technically that drum roll wouldn't be counted as my downbeat. Well, anywhere can be your downbeat, but it's completely up to you as where you decide your downbeat is going to be. So for instance, let me play the drum roll. So I'll probably start and find the downbeat right here after this whole drum break, right here where everybody comes right in. So I started here. All right. So once I find that downbeat, and once again, the downbeat could be anywhere in your piece of music. It's just where you're declaring that downbeat to be. I'm going to go ahead and right-click with my mouse on that play marker. We're going to hit right-click and choose Set 111 here. That's set bar 1, beat 1 here. And what that's going to do is it's going to let Ableton Live know that from this moment forward, I want you to treat that moment I just set as bar 1, measure 1, and automatically warp from here. All right, or automatically just get a sense of what I want you to do from here. So once we've done that, the last step would be right-clicking that first warp marker and choose warp from here. And now what we've got is Ableton Live will take into account where you've placed your bar 1, beat 1, and it's going to warp according to its algorithms there. And if you look right underneath the warp button where it says segment BPM, it'll give you more or less an estimate as where it thinks the original BPM is. Now I'm at 145 BPM, so I'm going to put the metronome on and see if this did it correctly, if the warping is in time. Cool. So now it's warped in time. We can see all the trends is kind of lining up. The cool thing is you still see some things just off the grid, and that's fine. You can just always double click a warp marker and just snap it over to the grid. And once you've done that, you can just right click on that if you want and say warp from here, so that it would just continuously just snap everything to that. But one thing to keep in mind, that once you've done this, it also snapped and fixed the timing for anything before the bar 1, beat 1. So now everything previous or to the left of that is in time as well. So we've got our, let's just see if we can just warp this. Let's loop this section here. And now that we have that set in place, we can go ahead and move the tempo to whatever it is we want. And the file, the warped audio will stay with that. Now, a couple cool things to keep in mind when you're warping audio. And these are different tools and tips and techniques that I usually incorporate in my production to kind of help just, be more creative and find new creative sparks of inspiration within the same sample or audio that I'm using. So if we focus over here to this warping section, the warp menu here, there's different warping algorithms, meaning that there's different ways that Ableton Live will treat the audio and the way it warps it. So by default, it stays on beats, and you could change that into preferences. But beats would be a great warping algorithm to use if you're using percussive elements or drum loops or loops that have very present and evident transients. That makes it easy for Live to kind of just guess from one transient to the next. And if you see here, it says preserve. So the preserving means that it will preserve from one transient, and then what it does is it tries to play it, backwards or in reverse until it reaches the next transient. So for instance, let's mark this one here, and the bar 1 beat 2 to the bar 1 beat 3. So what's going to happen is once it plays this transient on its way to this one, if the BPM difference is really drastic from the original BPM of this loop, then what it'll do is you'll hear that you'll get a little bit this gargly or reversed sounding sound from the audio, because it's just trying to continuously play this backwards until we reach the next transient. All right, so let me give you an example. The original BPM for this is like 120. So let's move this down all the way to like. So you see that where it's starting to just like drag a little bit. So you can mess around with the transits. You can say, I want you to preserve every quarter note. So it just preserves the quarter note count. So maybe it'll just be 1. Like that's the count here. And then this, it will just automatically flip and reverse. And then you can also mess with, you see here, it's playing it. It plays it once and then tries to play it backwards. You can just set it here where it plays once after the initial transient, and then that's it. So if I set it to every 8th note, that's how you can kind of get that nice little 8th note gated pattern without actually having to use a gate. And then the lower value you give here on this preserving of the transients, the shorter, and it's almost like lowering the decay. So it's a pretty cool feature, and that you really get to highlight when you're using beats mode. Tones and texture are more like the old school sampling basis in which you would time stretch something. So I would use this usually in my arrangements where I wanted that one note to feel like it's being time stretched. So we can drag that one note here, and then we get that really cool old school time stretch vibe. Always kind of reminds me of The Prodigy, and he uses a lot of this. Well, because a majority of the stuff that he was using, like in the Fat of the Land, were all those old school samplers. So same thing with texture. So texture does the same thing. It just, you're able to change the grain size. So these are all really cool, helpful tools to just be creative with changing the soundscape of the audio. Then we go to repitch. And repitch is literally just like what we do with a turntable, is where you're actually pitching up or down the sample so that it matches the tempo. And so if we have a warp marker, it's really just pitching that one down, and then this one over here higher, so that it can speed up and catch up with the tempo. Now the problem is, you can see that if you try to do this, you'll have one pitch, and then this one will slightly be detuned, and then this one will be detuned. So it makes it really difficult when you have samples with musical elements in them. A great way to use repitch is to probably just take away some of the warp markers inside, and then you go ahead and use this to go half time or double time. So that's a great thing to do. Then you have Complex and Complex Pro. And these are usually the ones you would be using when you're trying to keep the best integrity of the audio when you're warping in Ableton Live. So if we're going from 119 to 90 BPMs, and we'll bring this back to and Complex Pro, these are probably the best to use, especially with vocals or long pieces of samples, or just even try some musical movement. You might want to use these because they would keep the integrity the best. But one thing to take note is that if you're trying to use Complex Pro and you're trying to pitch up the sample, it will still try to maintain the format, meaning that it will try its best to stay in its original format. And so if you're really trying to get the sample to just sound pitched up but yet keep the same timing, then you would probably be better off at Complex. So those are some cool things to utilize and do with the warping. I also love hitting the reverse button to flip a sample in reverse and then incorporate a little bit of some transposing to see what kind of unique stuff you get with the sample. We can also use the warp markers to change the actual arrangement of the audio around, somewhat like quantizing the MIDI that you would record when using a virtual instrument or any external MIDI. So I'll just grab a sample here, drag it into that, and let's play this out over. So I'll just highlight that first section here, and what we'll do is there's several things. I mean, you could just hit your quantize command key and it will snap all the warp markers and transits to the nearest grid, but we can go ahead now and create a whole nother rhythm. So let's click this, drag that over here. So I kind of like that, and then what I'll do is snap this over here. Maybe just move this over here. Now, I'm going to utilize everything I just showed you previously. I'm going to put it all into effect. So what we're going to do is, we're in beats mode. We'll take it off the forward backwards mode and bring down the transient a little bit. Maybe just keep that up a little. Let's try repitch. We'll repitch to see what happens with all the warp markers in the place that we just put them in. Not too crazy. So let's stay with let's try complex. Now you notice that from complex to beats maintain a little bit of the attack in the transits. So now what we'll do is let's pitch this down at 5 and reverse it. Cool. And now what I can do is now create some more soundscapes by adding some filtering and maybe even throwing a reverb as an insert here. So we can just filter any top end out and bring this in. So, I mean, that's usually how I, go about getting lost in warping when it comes to incorporating some audio into my projects. It's a really helpful tool for me to just navigate and just create some sparks of inspiration to help me get going with some creative ideas.